The forest doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And sometimes, when the moon hangs like a wound in the night sky and the wind carries whispers of things that should not be, the forest reveals its true nature. What you're about to read happened to me during my final weeks as a park ranger in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. I've written this account not as fiction, but as a warning. Some boundaries should never be crossed. Some territories belong to things older and hungrier than we can comprehend. The official report listed my resignation as medical leave due to psychological stress. The truth is far more terrifying. What I encountered in those ancient woods changed me forever, left scars that no medicine can heal. I see it in my dreams now, hear its voice in the rustling of leaves, feel its presence in every shadow. You may not believe what follows, but somewhere deep in the primal part of your brain that remembers when humans were prey, you'll recognize the truth. This is my story. This is my confession. This is my warning. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw, what I survived, and what's still out there waiting in the darkness between the trees. I'd been a ranger for 15 years when it began, long enough to know the difference between animal tracks and something else entirely. Long enough to recognize when the forest itself holds its breath in fear. It started with the silence. On a Tuesday morning in late September, I hiked the Whispering Creek Trail for my weekly patrol. The autumn air bit sharp against my face, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else I couldn't identify, something metallic and wrong. The usual symphony of forest sounds had vanished. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the creek seemed to flow more quietly, as if afraid to make noise. I'd walked this trail hundreds of times, memorized every root and stone. But that morning, everything felt different. The shadows stretched longer despite the morning sun. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches forming a canopy that blocked more light than it should. And the smell, that metallic rawness, grew stronger with each step. 3 miles in, I found the first sign. A deer carcass hung 20 feet up in an old-growth fir, wedged between 2 massive branches. No predator I knew could carry a full-grown buck that high. The body showed no bite marks, no claw wounds. Instead, the hide had been peeled away in perfect strips, like someone had carefully unwrapped a gift. The meat beneath remained untouched, already bloated with decay. I radioed headquarters, reported the unusual find. Sarah Chen, our district supervisor, suggested a bear had cached its kill, despite my protests that bears don't skin their prey with surgical precision. She promised to send a wildlife biologist out to investigate, but I knew Maxwell Rodriguez wouldn't find anything that would satisfy the growing dread in my gut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my cabin's old timbers sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind through the pines whispered my name. I found myself checking the locks on my doors and windows, something I'd never done in all my years living alone in the forest. When exhaustion finally claimed me near dawn, my dreams filled with images of something watching from the tree-line, something that wore the shapes of familiar things but wasn't quite right. The second sign came 3 days later. I was checking the bear-proof garbage containers near the Cascade Vista campground when I noticed the tracks. They started human, the clear impression of a hiking boot in the soft earth beside the restrooms. But as I followed them into the tree-line, they changed. The heel elongated. The toe marks stretched and separated, becoming something more like claws. By the time the tracks disappeared into a patch of granite bedrock, they looked more animal than human, though no animal I could identify. The tracks measured nearly 18 inches long. I took photographs, made plaster casts, documented everything with the methodical precision of my training. But my hands shook as I worked, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder at the dark spaces between the trees. Something was watching me. I could feel its attention like a weight on my shoulders, could sense its hunger even though I couldn't see it. The biologist examined my evidence with skeptical interest. Maxwell had worked in these mountains for 20 years, seen everything from mutant raccoons to albino bears. But even he couldn't explain the tracks. His official report described them as unusual formations possibly created by natural erosion and pareidolia, seeing patterns where none existed. In private, he admitted the casts made his skin crawl. Whatever made these, he told me over coffee at the ranger station, it's big. And it's smart enough to avoid the trail cameras. That was the problem. We'd installed motion-activated cameras throughout the sector after reports of missing hikers began filtering in from neighboring districts. Every camera captured the same thing, normal forest activity until exactly 3:17 a.m. each night, when they went dark for precisely 47 minutes. When they resumed recording, we find new evidence of the thing's presence: broken branches, scattered fur from various animals, and always those impossible tracks leading to and from the dead zones. The missing persons reports started accumulating on my desk like autumn leaves. Vincent Hayes, a solo backpacker who checked in at the Pine Ridge trailhead and never returned. Tyler Morrison, an experienced hiker whose abandoned campsite showed signs of a struggle but no blood, no body. Caroline Pierce, a nature photographer whose camera we found smashed against a tree trunk, the memory card corrupted beyond recovery. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Experienced outdoors people. Solo travelers. Last seen heading into the deepest parts of the forest where cell service died and the old trees grew close enough to block the sun. Search parties found minimal evidence: scattered gear, cold campsites, and those impossible tracks that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. I started volunteering for every search mission, driven by a need to understand what was happening in my forest. During one search for Austin Blake, a missing rock climber, we found something that changed everything. Hidden in a grove of ancient cedars, 20 feet off any established trail, lay a clearing I'd never seen before despite patrolling this area for years. The ground had been scraped clear of vegetation, forming a perfect circle 30 feet across. In the center sat a pile of bones, animal and otherwise, arranged with deliberate care. The bones showed no teeth marks, no signs of scavenging. They'd been cracked open and the marrow extracted with surgical precision. Worse than the bones were the pieces of fabric scattered throughout the clearing, scraps of modern hiking gear and camping equipment that matched the descriptions of items belonging to our missing persons. But it was what we found at the edge of the clearing that made my blood run cold. Skin. Human skin, tanned and preserved like leather, stretched between two trees as if hung out to dry. The pieces varied in size and color, suggesting multiple sources. Some still bore the faded traces of tattoos. Others showed tan lines from clothing and jewelry. All had been removed with expert precision, the edges clean and even as if cut by someone with extensive anatomical knowledge. I wanted to call in the FBI, declare the area a crime scene, bring in every resource we had to hunt down whatever monster was responsible. But when I returned with the forensics team the next morning, the clearing was gone. Not abandoned, gone. Where the circle of bones and horrific trophies had been, we found only normal forest floor, undisturbed leaf litter and healthy undergrowth that looked decades old. Even the GPS coordinates I carefully marked led us to nothing but empty woods. The other search team members looked at me with growing concern as I insisted we were in the right location, as I pointed to where I'd seen horrors that no longer existed. My reputation for reliability, built over 15 years of faithful service, crumbled in a single morning. Saracen suggested I take some time off, get some rest, maybe talk to someone about the stress of so many missing persons cases. But I knew what I'd seen. And I knew it was still out there. That night, alone in my cabin as rain drummed against the windows, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I would find the truth, whatever it cost me. I would track this thing through the deepest parts of the forest, follow it to its lair, and end the nightmare that had consumed my world. I had no idea that the nightmare was just beginning. The old-growth section of the Cascade Wilderness stretched for over 50 square miles of roadless, trail-free forest where the trees grew so thick that GPS signals died and compasses spun like confused dancers. It was the kind of place that swallowed hikers whole, where search and rescue teams feared to venture even in daylight. And it was exactly where the tracks always led before disappearing into the granite and shadow. I'd been planning this expedition for 2 weeks, gathering supplies and studying topographical maps by lamplight in my cabin. Official channels had failed me. The thing, whatever it was, had made a mockery of our standard procedures, vanishing evidence and evading our cameras with an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. If I was going to find answers, I have to venture beyond the mapped world, into the spaces between the lines where monsters might hide. My pack contained enough supplies for 5 days, freeze-dried rations, a water purification system, medical supplies, emergency shelter, and enough batteries to keep my equipment running. I'd also packed items not found in any ranger manual, a modified trail camera with military-grade night vision, motion sensors borrowed from a friend in private security, and a .45 caliber pistol that Sarah Chin would have my badge for if she knew about it. I left before dawn on a Friday, telling Sarah I was taking a mental health day in Seattle. Instead, I drove to the most remote access point in our district, a forgotten logging road that petered out into deer paths and bear trails. From there, I would hike into the heart of the deep forest, following the patterns I'd observed in the missing persons cases and the scattered evidence we'd found. The morning mist clung to the forest floor as I began my descent into the valley. Ancient cedars and Douglas firs towered overhead, their trunks thick enough to hide a school bus. The canopy blocked so much light that my flashlight remained necessary even at midday. Everything about this place felt old, not just the trees, but the very air itself, heavy with the weight of centuries. 3 hours in, I found the first indication I was on the right track. Scattered along a game trail were bones, small ones at first, squirrels, rabbits, songbirds. All showed the same precise processing I'd seen before: marrow extracted, meat consumed, hide removed with surgical care. The bones had been arranged in small piles, as if someone was collecting them for a specific purpose. The trail of bone piles led deeper into the valley, away from any human habitation or established path. I followed them like breadcrumbs, documenting each find with my camera and GPS unit. The forest around me grew quieter with each mile, until the only sounds were my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. By late afternoon, I descended nearly 2,000 feet into a valley that didn't appear on any map. The trees here were different, older, stranger, twisted into shapes that suggested they'd grown in response to something other than sunlight. Spanish moss hung from their branches despite being thousands of miles from its natural habitat. The very air smelled different, carrying scents of decay and something else, something alive and hungry. I made camp in a small clearing beside a stream that ran black despite its clear water. As I set up my tent, I placed the motion sensors in a perimeter around my campsite, each one equipped with silent alerts that would vibrate a receiver on my wrist. If anything larger than a chipmunk moved within 50 yards of my position, I'd know about it. The modified trail camera went on a tree 20 yards away, positioned to capture the entire clearing with its enhanced night vision. If the thing came for me, at least there would be evidence of what happened. Maybe the next person foolish enough to venture into these woods would find my camera and learn from my mistakes. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to sounds that had no place in any normal forest. Branches breaking in patterns too rhythmic to be natural. Something large moving through the underbrush with deliberate care, circling my camp just beyond the range of my sensors. And underneath it all, a sound that made my skin crawl, a low humming, almost like singing, in a voice that seemed to shift between human and something else entirely. At 3:17 a.m., my motion sensors went silent. I woke to find my wrist receiver dark, its LED display blank despite the fresh batteries I'd installed that morning. The silence that followed was absolute: no wind, no water, no insects. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around me. Through the mesh window of my tent, I saw a shadow moving between the trees. It walked upright like a human but moved with the fluid grace of a predator. Its limbs seemed too long, its proportions wrong in ways my brain struggled to process. What I first took for clothing resulted into something far worse as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The thing wore skin-like garments, patches of different colors and textures stitched together with what looked like sinew. Some pieces still bore hair or fur, creating a macabre patchwork that shifted and rippled with each movement. The creature paused at the edge of my clearing, close enough that I could see its face in the starlight filtering through the canopy. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. It had no face of its own. Instead, stretched across the front of its skull was a mask of human skin, the features expertly preserved but wound too wide for the underlying bone structure, the eyes misaligned, the mouth hanging slack like an empty sleeve. Below it, more faces were layered and stitched, creating a horrible collection of expressions frozen in death. But the eyes, the thing's real eyes, gleamed from the darkness beneath the mask. They were intelligent, calculating, and utterly without mercy. They were the eyes of something that had been human once, long ago, before it chose to become something else entirely. The skin mutant tilted its head, studying my tent with the patience of a practiced hunter. When it opened its mouth, the borrowed face stretched and distorted, revealing rows of filed teeth behind lips that would never again speak words of love or comfort. The humming sound I'd heard earlier emerged from deep in its throat, a lullaby written in frequencies that made my bones ache. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, barely daring to breathe as the thing circled my campsite. It moved with supernatural quiet, its footsteps making no sound on the forest floor despite its obvious size. When it passed directly in front of my tent, I caught its scent, the metallic rawness I detected on that first morning, mixed with the smell of poorly cured leather and something else that made my stomach revolt. It was the smell of someone who had worn too many skins that weren't their own. The creature completed its circuit of my camp and melted back into the forest as silently as it had come. Only when the normal sounds of night began to return did I dare to move, checking the luminous dial of my watch to find that 47 minutes had passed, exactly the same duration as the dead zones on our security cameras. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Dawn brought no relief. My motion sensors remained dead, their electronics apparently fried by whatever had passed through the clearing. The trail camera was gone entirely, its mounting bracket empty and the tree showing fresh scratches where something had climbed to retrieve it. Even the stream seemed to run darker than before, carrying the scent of decay downstream to whatever waited in the deeper parts of the valley. But it had left me something in return. Hanging from a branch directly over my tent was a piece of skin, human skin, tanned and prepared with the same care I'd seen in the hidden clearing. This one was different, though. This one bore a familiar tattoo, an eagle and anchor that I recognized from the missing person report for Justin Rivera, a former Marine who disappeared 6 weeks earlier. The message was clear. The thing knew I was hunting it. And now it was hunting me. I broke camp quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack with shaking hands. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes, every sound carried the threat of discovery. The smart thing would have been to retreat, to hike back to civilization and find a new career in a place where the worst predators were other humans. But Justin Rivera deserved better than to become part of a monster's wardrobe. They all did. I pushed deeper into the valley, following a stream that led toward the heart of the wilderness. The bone piles grew larger and more frequent, graduating from small forest animals to deer, elk, and other bones I couldn't identify. The trees grew stranger too, their bark scarred with claw marks and strange symbols that looked almost like writing. Spanish moss draped everything in funeral shrouds, creating a cathedral of the damned where something wearing the faces of the dead conducted its unholy services. By midday, I reached the place where the stream disappeared into a cave system carved into the living rock of the mountain. The entrance yawned 40 feet wide and 20 feet tall, its depths black as original sin. The smell that emerged from its depths made the metallic rawness seem pleasant by comparison. It was the smell of a charnel house, of bodies left to rot in airless spaces where sunlight never reached. Standing at the cave mouth, I found the final proof of what I was dealing with. Stretched between two stone pillars like macabre curtains were skins, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Human skins of every age and description, expertly preserved and displayed like trophies. They moved in the slight breeze from the cave, creating a grotesque ballet of the dead that made my vision swim with horror. But it was what I found carved into the stone above the entrance that made me understand the true scope of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. In letters 3 feet tall, burned into the living rock with acids that had stained the stone black, someone had written a single word in a language I didn't recognize but understood with primal terror. Skinwalker. This wasn't just a monster hiding in the forest. This was something with history, something with tradition, something that had been perfecting its craft for longer than our civilization had existed. And somewhere in the darkness beyond those hanging skins, it waited for me to join its collection. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and never look back. But as I stood at the threshold of hell, I thought about all the missing people, all the families waiting for answers that would never come. Someone had to bear witness. Someone had to survive long enough to tell the truth. I checked my pistol, said a prayer to whatever gods might still watch over fools and heroes, and stepped into the darkness. The cave entrance swallowed me like the throat of some primordial beast. My flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet into the darkness before being absorbed by shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. The hanging skins brushed against my shoulders as I passed, their leathery touch leaving trails of cold that penetrated to my bones. Each one told a story of terror and loss, of final moments when someone realized they would never see home again. The cave system extended far deeper than any natural formation should have, tunnels branching off in directions that defied the mountain's known geology. The walls showed tool marks, evidence of deliberate excavation and expansion. Someone had been working these caves for decades, maybe centuries, carving out chambers and passages for purposes I was only beginning to understand. 20 feet inside, I found the first workshop. The chamber opened to my left, roughly circular and 30 feet across. The walls were lined with wooden frames where skins hung in various stages of preparation. Some still dripped with the chemicals used in the tanning process, filling the air with acrid fumes that burned my throat and eyes. Others had been expertly sewn together into larger pieces, coats, robes, and other garments that suggested their wearer had moved beyond mere collection to active use. Along one wall, crude shelves held an assortment of tools that belonged in a taxidermist's nightmare. Flensing knives with handles worn smooth by decades of use. Needles and thread for joining pieces. Bottles containing chemicals and preservatives, their labels written in that same unknown script I'd seen at the cave entrance. And in the center of it all, a workbench stained black with substances I didn't want to identify. But it was the journal lying open on the bench that stopped me cold. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, written in English in a careful hand that spoke of education and intelligence. Dates going back 40 years. Detailed descriptions of techniques for skin removal and preservation. Maps of the surrounding forest marking hunting grounds and safe paths. And scattered throughout, sketches of the thing I'd seen in my camp, or rather, what it had been before it began its transformation. The early entries read like the diary of a park ranger not unlike myself. Someone who loved the forest and wanted to protect it from encroachment. Someone who discovered something in these caves and made a choice that damned him forever. June 15, 1983, found the old ceremonial site today. The symbols matched the descriptions in grandfather's stories, the ones he swore were just legends. But the power here is real. I can feel it in the stones, in the air itself. Something waits in the deep caves, something that remembers the old ways. June 20th, 1983, made contact. It spoke to me in dreams, showed me visions of what I could become. The rangers want to close this section of forest to development. They don't understand that some places are already owned. Some places have guardians. July 4th, 1983, first transformation. The pain is incredible, but so is the clarity that follows. I can see in the dark now, hear heartbeats from a mile away. The old boundaries don't apply anymore. I am becoming something more than human. July 15th, 1983, need to feed. The hunger is constant now, demanding more than animal flesh can provide. The hikers come so willingly into my domain. They never expect the ranger to be their predator. The entries continued for years, documenting a slow descent into monstrosity. The writer described each kill with clinical precision, noting which skins preserved best and which techniques produced the finest results. He wrote about wearing the faces of his victims to lure others, about the intoxicating feeling of literally walking in another person's skin. The final entries spoke of something beyond mere murder and mutilation. October 31st, 1995, the great work is nearly complete. 47 confirmed kills, each one chosen for specific qualities. Soon I will have enough material to perform the final binding. The cave spirits grow restless with anticipation. November 15th, 1995, something went wrong. The binding requires a willing sacrifice, someone who understands the true nature of power. The unwilling dead cannot complete the transformation. I must find one who will choose to join me in immortality. The final entry was dated just 3 days ago. September 20th, 2023, he has come at last. The one who sent carries the same understanding, the same protective hunger. I have watched him search, seen him document my work with the reverence of a true student. Soon he will stand where I stand now, reading my words. Soon he will understand that some guardians are chosen by the forest itself. My blood turned to ice water as I read my own fate written in a dead man's hand. This wasn't random predation or simple madness. This was recruitment. The thing had been studying me, learning my patterns, drawing me deeper into its web with the patience of something that had waited decades for the right candidate. A sound echoed from the deeper caves, the same humming I heard in my camp, but louder now, more confident. It knew I'd found the journal. It knew I understood. The pretense of hunting was over. Now came the real test. I drew my pistol and continued deeper into the complex, following the sound through passages that grew progressively stranger. The walls here showed evidence of different construction techniques, older methods using stone tools and primitive cement. Some sections had been carved by human hands, but others showed the tooth marks of something else entirely, something with jaws capable of chewing through solid rock. The tunnels branched and rejoined in patterns that made no geometric sense. I tried to maintain my sense of direction, but the compass spun wildly and my GPS unit showed nothing but static. The cave system existed in its own space, governed by rules that had nothing to do with normal geography. I passed more workshops, each one specializing in different aspects of the craft. One chamber contained rows of metal hooks where fresh kills hung like sides of beef in a butcher shop. Another held soaking vats filled with chemicals that preserved tissue while maintaining flexibility. A third was dedicated to needlework, with sewing machines both modern and antique arranged around partially completed garments that would have made a medieval torturer jealous. But it was the gallery that nearly broke my sanity. The chamber stretched over 100 feet in every direction, its walls covered floor to ceiling with mounted displays. Each one showed a different victim, their skin carefully preserved and arranged to suggest a living person. Nameplates provided dates and brief descriptions. Vincent Hayes, solo hiker, September 2023. Caroline Pierce, nature photographer, August 2023. Names from my missing persons file stared back at me with empty eye sockets, their final moments preserved for eternity. At the center of the gallery stood a mannequin wearing the most elaborate creation yet, a full-body suit made from dozens of different skins, each piece chosen for specific qualities and stitched together with surgical precision. The face was a composite of 3 different people, their features blended into something that looked almost normal until you noticed the seams. It wore the badge and uniform of a park ranger, the fabric stained with substances that had once been human. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice came from directly behind me, impossibly close considering I'd heard no footsteps. I spun around to find the thing standing just outside my flashlight beam, its current face split in a smile that showed rows of filed teeth. Up close, I could see the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. The creature wore a coat made from at least 20 different skins, each one perfectly preserved and tailored to fit its elongated frame. The face it currently displayed had once belonged to a young woman, probably a hiker who trusted the wrong guide. Her features had been stretched and modified to fit over the thing's inhuman skull, creating an effect that was both beautiful and utterly wrong. 47 years I've worked to perfect the art, it continued, its voice a horrible mixture of human speech and something else. 47 lives given to preserve beauty forever. But something was always missing. The willing participant. The true partner in creation. It gestured toward the mannequin with one clawed hand. This was meant to be your uniform. Your contribution to the great work. But I've been watching you, studying your methods. You understand preservation. You understand the sacred duty of protecting the wild places from those who would destroy them. The thing began to circle me, moving with fluid grace despite its impossible proportions. They come here thinking they own the forest. Thinking they can take whatever they want, leave whatever they please. But we know better, don't we? We understand that some things must be preserved exactly as they are, no matter the cost. I tried to track its movement with my weapon, but it stayed just outside the flashlight's range, a shadow-given substance and malevolent will. You've seen my work. You've studied it with the dedication of a true craftsman. Join me, and I'll teach you secrets that no textbook contains. Together, we can ensure that this forest remains pure forever. You're insane, I managed to whisper, though my voice carried no conviction. Part of me, a part one tried desperately to suppress, understood what it was offering. Eternal purpose. The power to truly protect the wilderness I loved. And all it would cost was my humanity. The creature laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. Sanity is a luxury for those who don't understand the true nature of existence. Look around you. 47 perfect preservations. 47 souls saved from the corruption of civilization. Their beauty will last forever, untouched by time or decay. It stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could smell the chemicals and decay that clung to its patchwork form. I was like you once. A guardian of these mountains. But guardianship requires sacrifice. The willingness to become something more than human when humanity isn't enough. The thing reached toward me with one elongated hand, its fingers ending in claws that could strip flesh from bone with surgical precision. Feel the power in this place. Feel the weight of centuries, the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. This cave system is older than your civilization. The native peoples knew its purpose. They fed it willing offerings to keep the darkness contained. But the old ways were forgotten. The offerings stopped. So the darkness found new forms, new purposes. I became its agent, its hands in the modern world. But I'm old now, tired. The great work needs fresh blood, fresh vision. My pistol felt heavy in my hand, inadequate against something that had already died decades ago and been reborn as something else. But I had to try. For all the missing people, for all the families still waiting for answers, I had to find a way to end this nightmare. What makes you think I'd ever join you? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The creature's borrowed face split in a grin that revealed far too many teeth. Because you're already changing. Did you think exposure to this place would leave you unmarked? The caves are alive, breathing, watching. They've been testing you since the moment you stepped inside. It was then that I noticed the changes. My vision had grown sharper, able to pick out details in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. My hearing had become acute enough to detect the creature's heartbeat, assuming it still had one. And the hunger, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of food would satisfy. The transformation has already begun, the thing whispered. Fight it, and you'll die as just another failed candidate. Embrace it, and you'll become something magnificent. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The caves grow impatient. As if summoned by its words, I felt movement in the darkness around us. Other things stirring in the depths, things that had been human once but had made different choices when faced with the same decision. The failed candidates. The ones who'd refused the offer and been consumed anyway. I raised my pistol, knowing it was probably useless but needing to make some gesture of defiance. I choose to remain human. The creature sighed, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. I had hoped for better from you. But perhaps you're not ready to see the truth. Perhaps you need more time to consider the alternatives. It gestured toward the shadows with one clawed hand, and I heard them beginning to move. Dozens of shapes detaching themselves from the cave walls, shambling forward with the jerky movements of marionettes controlled by an inexpert hand. The failed candidates, transformed into something neither human nor monster but caught forever between the two states. They'll keep you company while you think, the creature said, already beginning to fade back into the darkness. When you're ready to join me willingly, simply call my name. I'll be waiting in the deep places, preparing for the day when you finally understand that preservation requires sacrifice. As its voice echoed away into the tunnels, the shambling things emerged into my flashlight beam. I saw faces I recognized from missing person reports, twisted and wrong but still identifiable. They moved with hungry purpose, reaching toward me with fingers that ended in broken nails and exposed bone. I ran. Behind me, the failed candidates gave chase through passages that seemed to shift and change with each turn. My enhanced senses showed me paths invisible to normal human perception, routes through the cave system that shouldn't have existed but provided escape from the shuffling horrors. The creature's gift, helping me survive long enough to make the choice it wanted. I ran through galleries of preserved victims, past workshops where unspeakable crafts were practiced, through chambers carved from living rock by things that had never been entirely human. The caves went deeper than any mountain should contain, extending into spaces where geometry became flexible and distance lost all meaning. Finally, impossibly, I saw light ahead. Real sunlight, filtered through hanging skins but genuine nonetheless. I burst from the cave entrance into the fading afternoon, gasping air that tasted clean despite the metallic tang that seemed permanently lodged in my throat. But as I looked back at the cave mouth, I knew this wasn't an escape. It was a reprieve. The thing had let me go, confident that I would return when the changes it had started became too much to bear alone. It had marked me, claimed me, begun a transformation that could only be completed one of two ways. I could return willingly and join its immortal craft. Or I could fight the changes until they destroyed me, becoming just another failed candidate shambling through the darkness. Either way, I was no longer fully human. The forest had claimed me just as surely as it had claimed the ranger whose journal I'd read. The only question now was whether I would have any choice in what I became. I stumbled through the forest for hours, crashing through underbrush and scrambling over fallen logs in my desperate flight from the cave. The sun had set by the time I reached my abandoned campsite, and the enhanced night vision that had helped me navigate the tunnels now showed me every shadow, every movement in perfect, terrifying detail. The forest was alive with things that should have remained hidden, creatures that fled from my altered scent as if I carried some invisible mark of predation. My reflection in the stream's dark water confirmed my worst fears. My pupils had dilated to capture every photon of available light, giving my eyes an inhuman gleam. My fingernails had grown longer and harder, developing points sharp enough to score bark from trees. Most disturbing of all, my skin had begun to loosen in places, as if preparing for something that wanted to wear it differently. The transformation was accelerating. I tried to radio headquarters, desperate to report what I'd found and warn others away from the cave system. But my radio produced only static, the same electronic interference that had plagued our equipment throughout the disappearances. The thing, the original ranger who'd become something else, had planned for this. It wanted me isolated, cut off from help, forced to face the changes alone. By dawn, I'd made it back to the logging road where I'd left my vehicle. The drive to town passed in a haze of superhuman perception and growing hunger. Every small animal that crossed the road triggered predatory instincts I'd never experienced. The smell of other humans made my mouth water in ways that horrified me. Whatever the creature had done to me in that cave was rewriting fundamental parts of my biology. But I still had enough humanity left to fight it. I had to warn people, had to find a way to stop the nightmare before it spread beyond the forest. The thing had been content to hunt solo hikers and campers for decades, but its talk of a great work suggested bigger plans. Plans that might require more than one guardian to implement. I drove straight to the ranger station, ignoring the concerned looks from my colleagues as I burst through the door with wild hair and clothes torn by my flight through the woods. Saracen took one look at me and immediately called for medical attention, assuming I had some kind of breakdown in the wilderness. I tried to explain about the cave, about the skin-wearing creature and its gallery of victims, but my words came out in a rushed babble that sounded insane even to my own ears. They sedated me before I could finish my report. I woke up in the county hospital, strapped to a bed with thick leather restraints. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about psychological breaks, about the stress of too many missing persons cases finally overwhelming a dedicated ranger's mind. They showed me the photos I'd taken, empty forest scenes with no trace of the bone piles and tracks I documented so carefully. My plaster casts had crumbled to dust during the night, leaving no evidence of the impossible footprints. But the creature's changes to my body were progressing faster than its ability to erase evidence. My fingernails continued to grow despite the staff trimming them twice daily. My skin grew looser and more flexible, taking on a waxy quality that reminded me of poorly preserved leather. And the hunger, the terrible, gnawing hunger for something no hospital cafeteria could provide, grew stronger with each passing hour. On the third night, I managed to slip my restraints. The transformation had given me more than enhanced senses and predatory instincts. My joints had become unnaturally flexible, allowing me to dislocate bones and compress my frame in ways that would have been impossible for a normal human. I flowed out of the restraints like liquid, reformed my shoulders with barely a sound, and padded barefoot through the darkened hospital corridors. Every patient I passed smelled like potential prey. The nurses and security guards carried scents that spoke of fear and vulnerability, triggering responses I struggled to control. Part of me wanted to return to my bed, to accept the doctor's explanations and let them treat my breakdown with medication and therapy. But a larger part recognized that path led only to destruction, either the consumption of innocent people or my own transformation into another failed candidate shambling through cave tunnels. I had to return to the forest. I had to face the thing that had marked me and find a way to break its hold before I became something that threatened everyone I had sworn to protect. I stole clothes from the hospital laundry, supplies from the emergency room, and a vehicle from the parking garage. By sunrise, I was back in the wilderness, following logging roads toward the deep valleys where nightmare waited patiently for my return. But this time, I wasn't going as a naive investigator stumbling into a trap. I was going as a hunter, armed with knowledge of my enemy and acceptance of what I might have to sacrifice to stop it. The creature had made one critical mistake in its confidence. It had shared too much, revealed too much about its methods and history. The journal entries had mentioned native ceremonies, old ways of containing the darkness that lived in these mountains. If the original inhabitants had found methods to control or appease the thing, perhaps those methods could be rediscovered and used. I spent 2 days researching in the county library, poring over historical accounts and anthropological studies of the regional tribes. Most of the records had been sanitized by well-meaning academics, but fragments of the old stories remained. References to a hunger that walks in borrowed skin. Descriptions of ceremonial sites where offerings were made to keep ancient evils contained. And most importantly, accounts of warrior societies tasked with hunting things that preyed on human settlements. The key lay in understanding what the creature really was. Not just a mad ranger who'd undergone some impossible transformation, but something far older that had learned to use human form as a tool. The cave system predated any known settlement, carved by generations of something that had perfected the art of wearing human skin like clothing. The ranger had simply been its latest recruit, chosen for his knowledge of the modern forest and ability to lure victims into the deep places. But if the stories were accurate, the creature had weaknesses. Specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood its true nature. Iron weapons blessed with certain rituals. Fire created from wood taken from trees struck by lightning. And most importantly, the willing sacrifice of someone who'd been partially transformed but retained enough humanity to choose death over corruption. The research painted a clear picture of what I would have to do. Return to the cave. Find the creature's true lair in the deepest chambers. And destroy it using methods passed down through generations of people who'd faced similar horrors. The fact that I was already changing might actually be an advantage. I could navigate its domain with enhanced senses while still possessing enough human will to resist its final offers. I spent the third day gathering supplies. A knife forged from meteoric iron purchased from a collector who thought I was building a fantasy weapon. Wood from an oak tree that showed clear signs of lightning strikes, carefully carved into stakes and arrows. Salt from ancient seabeds, known to disrupt the spiritual energies that allowed such creatures to maintain their unnatural existence. And finally, a small vial of my own blood, drawn before the transformation could progress any further. As the sun set on my 4th day of preparation, I felt the creature's influence pulling me back toward the mountains. The changes to my body had accelerated during my absence, as if proximity to the cave system somehow slowed the process. My skin hung loose in places, ready to be shed like a snake's scales. My teeth had grown sharper, better suited for rending flesh than consuming normal food. And the hunger had become a constant ache that made concentration nearly impossible. Time was running out. If I waited much longer, I would lose the ability to choose my own fate. The transformation would complete itself, and I would join the ranks of failed candidates or willing servants depending on how much humanity remained. Either way, the people I'd sworn to protect would face a new threat, one that knew all their weaknesses and hiding places. I drove back to the abandoned logging road as darkness fell, my enhanced vision turning the forest into a landscape of silver shadows and black depths. Every tree seemed to lean inward, creating paths that led inevitably toward the cave system. Every sound carried the promise of violence and consumption. The forest itself had become complicit in the creature's hunt, reshaped by decades of unnatural predation into something that served its appetites. But I was no longer the same person who'd first stumbled onto this nightmare. The changes that horrified me also provided advantages the creature might not expect. I could see in perfect darkness, move within human silence, and sense the emotional states of other living things. If I could resist the final stages of transformation long enough, I might be able to use its own gifts against it. The hike to the cave took half the time it had before, my altered physiology allowing me to navigate terrain that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer. I felt the creature's awareness touch my mind as I approached, its satisfaction in my return mixed with curiosity about the supplies I carried. It knew I'd come armed with more than conventional weapons, but its confidence remained unshaken. How many others had tried similar approaches over the decades? How many had failed in the final moments when faced with the choice between transformation and destruction? The cave entrance loomed before me, its hanging curtain of preserved skin stirring in a breeze that carried the scent of ancient death. My enhanced senses showed me details I'd missed during my first visit, symbols carved into the stone that matched descriptions from the historical accounts, worn smooth by centuries of ritual use. This place had been a site of power long before the first ranger discovered it, a threshold between the human world and something far older and hungrier. I lit a torch made from lightning-struck oak, its flame burning with unnatural intensity in the cave's stagnant air. The preserved skins recoiled from the light as if they retained some memory of living flesh. Good. The old methods still held power in this place where the normal laws of reality had been bent to serve inhuman appetites. I've returned, I called into the darkness, my voice echoing through passages that seemed to stretch far beyond the mountain's physical boundaries. But not as you expected. The creature's laughter drifted from the depths, amused and confident. I smell the iron you carry, the blessed flame you've kindled. Do you think the old superstitions will save you? This place has consumed warrior priests and monster hunters for longer than your people have walked upright. Their bones line the deepest chambers, their skins hang with all the others. Maybe, I replied, starting into the tunnels with my torch held high. But they didn't have what I have. They didn't understand what you really are. The creature's amusement faded slightly. And what am I, little guardian? What do you think you've learned in your brief time among the civilized? I passed the first workshop, noting how the preserved skins writhed away from my torch as if in pain. The blessed fire was already affecting the creature's domain, disrupting the unnatural preservation that maintained its collections. You're not some ancient evil or prehistoric monster. You're a parasite. A spiritual infection that spreads from host to host, growing stronger with each generation but never truly alive. The tunnels ahead erupted with shrieking sounds as my words struck home. The failed candidates came pouring from side chambers, their shambling forms moving with desperate speed to intercept me before I could reach their master. But my enhanced reflexes allowed me to dance between their grasping hands, my iron knife opening wounds that bled darkness instead of blood. The first host was probably some native shaman who thought he could control you, I continued, cutting down the corrupted things that had once been human. But you consumed him from within, used his knowledge to perfect your methods. Each new host teaches you more about humanity, gives you better tools for hunting and deception. The creature's voice carried a note of genuine anger now. Clever little guardian. But knowledge without power is useless. You may understand what I am, but you lack the strength to destroy me. I am eternal. I am hunger itself given form and purpose. I fought my way deeper into the cave system, following passages lit by torches that burned with cleansing fire. The creature's influence pressed against my mind like a physical weight, promising ease and companionship if I would only stop this futile resistance. Part of me, the part that was changing, wanted to listen. But the part that remembered my oath to protect innocent people drove me forward through galleries of death and chambers of unspeakable craft. Finally, I reached the heart of the cave system, a vast chamber where the original ceremonies had once been conducted. The walls were covered with petroglyphs that told the story of the creature's first arrival, its initial containment, and the gradual breakdown of the rituals that had kept it bound. In the center of the chamber sat a throne carved from what looked like human bones, fused together with substances that reflected my torchlight with oily iridescence. The creature waited there in its true form, not the patchwork of stolen skins it wore in the outer tunnels, but something far older and more terrible. It was mostly human in shape but wrong in every detail, as if someone had tried to recreate humanity from second-hand descriptions. Its skin was translucent, showing the writhing darkness that served as its true substance. Its eyes were holes in reality that led to spaces where light had never existed. "Welcome to my true home," it said, gesturing toward the petroglyphs with limbs that bent in too many directions. Here you can see the entire history of our relationship. Your people once honored me with proper sacrifices, willing offerings that kept me fed and contained. But civilization made them forget the old bargains. They stopped feeding me, so I learned to feed myself. I raised my iron knife, its blade gleaming with reflected torchlight. The bargains were made under false pretenses. You were never a god to be worshipped. You were a prisoner to be contained. The creature rose from its throne, towering over me with supernatural height. Prisoner? I am the apex of evolution. I am what humanity could become if it abandoned the weakness of conscience and morality. Look at yourself, already you're becoming something better, something stronger. It was right. The changes had accelerated during my journey through the caves, my body preparing for a transformation I might not be able to resist much longer. But that also meant the ritual window was closing. If the old methods were going to work, I had to act before the creature's influence became complete. I drove the iron blade into my own palm, letting blood flow onto the chamber's stone floor. The symbols carved into the walls began to glow with faint light as my partially transformed essence activated circuits of power laid down by ancient hands. The creature recoiled as if struck, its form wavering like smoke in a sudden breeze. "What are you doing?" it demanded, genuine fear creeping into its voice for the first time. I began reciting words I'd memorized from the oldest accounts, syllables in a language that predated any known human tongue. The petroglyphs blazed brighter with each phrase, their light driving back the darkness that comprised the creature's true form. This was the original binding ceremony, the ritual that had first trapped it in these caves where it could be contained and controlled. But the bindings had been designed for a creature that fed on willing sacrifices, not one that had learned to hunt and corrupt on its own. My blood alone wasn't enough to complete the ritual. It required something more, something the original shamans could never have imagined needing. The willing sacrifice of someone who understood exactly what they were destroying. The creature writhed in agony as the ancient symbols blazed with increasing intensity, their light carving deep shadows into its translucent form. But I could feel the ritual faltering, the binding incomplete without the final component that would seal it forever. My partially transformed blood had activated the old protections, but they were designed to contain something that accepted limitations, not something that had spent decades learning to break every rule. "You think you can imprison me again?" the creature hissed, its voice harmonizing with itself in frequencies that made the stone walls vibrate. "I am not the simple hunger your ancestors first encountered. I have grown, learned, evolved. These caves can no longer hold what I have become." It was right. The petroglyphs were already beginning to dim, their ancient power insufficient against a parasite that had absorbed the knowledge and cunning of 47 victims. The creature had become something beyond the original binding, a hybrid of spiritual corruption and human intelligence that could adapt to any containment. But as I watched the ritual symbols fade, I realized the ancestors had planned for this possibility. Hidden among the ceremonial markings were secondary symbols, darker and more complex than the original binding. These weren't meant to contain the creature, they were meant to destroy it, along with anyone corrupted by its influence. The cost would be everything I had left to sacrifice. "There is another way," the creature whispered, sensing my discovery of the symbols. "You could join me willingly, add your knowledge to mine. Together, we could perfect a great work, create something worthy of this ancient place. Think of the people we could save by removing them from a world bent on destruction." The offer carried genuine temptation. The transformation had progressed far enough that I could feel the creature's perspective like an overlay on my own thoughts. It saw itself as a guardian of sorts, preserving human beauty and potential in its purest form. Every skin in its collection represented someone saved from aging, from disease, from the slow corruption of civilization. In its twisted logic, murder was an act of mercy. "You're insane," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Part of me, the part that was no longer entirely human, could see the appeal in its philosophy. "Sanity is a luxury for creatures bound by time and mortality," it replied, beginning to circle me as the ritual light continued to fade. "You've felt the hunger, haven't you? The need to preserve, to protect, to keep beautiful things safe from change. It's not madness, it's evolution." The failed candidates began emerging from the surrounding tunnels, drawn by their master's call. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, shambling through passages that connected to cave systems throughout the mountain range. Not all of them were recent. Some showed the preserved features of people who'd gone missing decades ago, their transformations incomplete but their humanity long since consumed. They chose poorly, the creature explained, noting my horrified fascination. They resisted the change, fought against the gifts I offered. But they serve a purpose nonetheless. Every guardian needs servants, every artist needs apprentices. They help maintain my workshops, tend my collections, hunt for new materials when I'm occupied with greater works. I understood now why the disappearances had been so carefully spaced over the years. The creature wasn't just collecting skins, it was building an army. Each failed candidate added to its workforce, creating a network of servants that could extend its influence far beyond these caves. And all of them had once been people like me, rangers and hikers and outdoor enthusiasts who'd stumbled across something they couldn't understand. How many are there? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The creature's borrowed face split in a grin that revealed too many teeth. Every national forest, every state park, every wilderness area where people go missing and are never found. Did you think I was the only one? Did you imagine this gift was confined to a single location? The implications hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't unique, it was part of a network, a plague of spiritual parasites that had infected guardians and protectors throughout the country. Each one creating its own collection, building its own army, working towards some coordinated goal that required resources beyond what any single entity could gather. The great work, I whispered, finally understanding the scope of what I faced. Precisely. The restoration of proper order, the return to ancient ways when humanity understood its place in the natural hierarchy. We are the apex predators this world requires, the guardians who will preserve what deserves preservation and eliminate what does not. The ritual symbols were almost completely dark now, their power exhausted without the final sacrifice needed to complete the binding. In moments, the creature would be free to resume its work, and I would either join its cause or become another failed candidate shambling through eternal darkness. But the secondary symbols, the ones meant for destruction rather than containment, still held faint traces of power. They required a different kind of sacrifice, one that would annihilate both the creature and anyone corrupted by its influence. Including me. I pressed my bleeding palm against the central destruction symbol, feeling its ancient power surge through my partially transformed nervous system. The creature recoiled as if struck, its form beginning to waver like heat distortion. "What are you doing?" it screamed, genuine terror replacing its confident arrogance. "You'll destroy yourself along with me. Everything you are, everything you could become." "I know," I said, beginning the ritual words that would activate the destruction sequence. "But that's better than becoming what you are." The creature lunged toward me with inhuman speed, its claws reaching for my throat before the symbols could complete their work. But the transformation had given me reflexes to match its own. I rolled aside, maintaining contact with the symbol as the creature's momentum carried it into the stone wall. "You fool," it raged, spinning to face me with fury that distorted its stolen features beyond recognition. "Do you think your death will end this? We are eternal. We are legion. Destroying one node will accomplish nothing." Maybe it was right. Maybe there were dozens or hundreds of similar creatures throughout the wilderness areas of North America, each one building toward the same terrible goal. But I could only deal with the monster in front of me, could only take responsibility for the people this particular creature threatened. The destruction symbols blazed to life with power that made the binding ritual seem gentle by comparison. This wasn't the clean, contained force of the original ceremony, this was raw annihilation, designed to sterilize an area so thoroughly that nothing corrupted could survive. The cave walls began to crack as energy that had been accumulating for millennia suddenly found release. The failed candidates collapsed as their animating force was severed, their borrowed existence ended in an instant of merciful oblivion. The creature itself began to dissolve, its form losing coherence as the spiritual parasite that gave it shape was systematically destroyed. But its voice continued to echo through the crumbling chamber, carrying promises and threats in equal measure. "This changes nothing," it screamed as chunks of stone began falling from the ceiling. "The network will continue. Others will take my place. Your sacrifice is meaningless." "Perhaps. But as I felt the annihilation force begin to consume my own corrupted cells, I found peace in knowing that at least this one threat would end here. The people whose skins decorated these walls would finally be allowed to rest. The families waiting for missing loved ones would never get answers, but at least no more innocents would join the creature's grotesque collection. The cave system began its final collapse as the destruction ritual reached its crescendo. Tons of stone fell from passages that had been carved over centuries, sealing the chambers where unspeakable crafts had been practiced. The creature made one last desperate attempt to reach me, its dissolving form stretching across the collapsing space between us. I met its gaze as the annihilation force reached my brain, feeling the last traces of its corruption burn away along with everything else that made me who I was. In that final moment, I saw something unexpected in its inhuman eyes, not hatred or rage, but a terrible, lonely sorrow. It had been human once, long ago, before the parasite consumed everything it had been. And for just an instant, I glimpsed a ranger who'd first found these caves and made the choice that damned him. Then the mountain came down, and everything went dark. I am writing this account from a hospital bed in Seattle, where I've spent the last 6 months recovering from what the doctors call severe delusional episodes with associated self-harm behaviors. The official report states that I was found 3 days after my disappearance, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration in a collapsed section of cave that showed signs of recent seismic activity. They say I was talking to myself when the search team found me, reciting strings of nonsense syllables while carving symbols into my own skin with a piece of broken stone. The infection from my self-inflicted wounds nearly killed me, but the physical healing has been the easy part. The psychological recovery continues under the care of specialists who nod sympathetically while I insist that my delusions were real. The cave system is gone, buried under thousands of tons of rock that shifted during what seismologists classified as a minor earthquake. The area has been declared geologically unstable and closed to public access indefinitely. Search teams found no trace of the missing hikers I claimed to have seen preserved there, though they did recover some scattered camping equipment that might have belonged to previous victims. My colleagues visit occasionally, their faces mixing concern with the uncomfortable pity reserved for those who've broken under pressure. Sarah Chen has been particularly kind, assuring me that my position will be waiting when I'm ready to return to work. She doesn't mention that my clearance for solo patrols has been permanently revoked, or that any future assignments will be strictly supervised. They don't understand that I'm not broken, I'm healed. The corruption that was transforming me into something inhuman burned away with the creature that created it. The enhanced senses are gone, the predatory instincts silenced, the gnawing hunger finally satisfied. I am completely, unremarkably human again, though the scars from my ordeal will never fully fade. But sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I remember the creature's final words. The network will continue, it had screamed as the cave collapsed around us. Others will take my place. And I wonder if somewhere in another wilderness, another ranger is finding impossible tracks, discovering hidden clearings, beginning to understand that some guardianships require sacrifices no sane person would willingly make. The missing persons reports continue to accumulate on other desks now, scattered across jurisdictions from coast to coast. Solo hikers who vanish without trace. Experienced outdoors people whose campsites show signs of struggle but no body, no blood. Nature photographers whose cameras are found smashed against trees, the memory cards corrupted beyond recovery. I read these reports obsessively, looking for patterns that might indicate another node in the network has become active. Part of me knows I should let someone else handle these investigations, should focus on my own recovery and leave the monster hunting to people who haven't already paid such a price. But I'm the only one who truly understands what we're facing, the only one who knows how to recognize the signs before it's too late. The forest doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And sometimes, when the moon hangs like a wound in the night sky and the wind carries whispers of things that should not be, the forest calls to those who've walked in its deepest places. I'm planning my return to active duty for next month. Sarah doesn't know it yet, but I've requested a transfer to a district where the missing persons reports are starting to follow familiar patterns. Somewhere in the North Cascades, something is wearing faces that don't belong to it and building collections that grow more elaborate with each kill. I can't save the people who are already gone, can't undo the choices that led them into the paths of predators that wore human skin like clothing. But I can honor their memory by ensuring their fate doesn't befall others. I can carry the knowledge bought with so much blood and use it to hunt the things that hunt us. The network thinks one destroyed node means nothing in the scope of its greater work. But they've made one critical error in their calculations. They've created their own hunter. And I know all their weaknesses now. Some things change you just by being witnessed. What I saw in those woods rewrote the very architecture of my nightmares, carved itself into my DNA like a virus of memory that reproduces every time I close my eyes. The forest keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets crawl out, wearing faces that used to belong to someone else. The radio crackled with static at 3:47 a.m., pulling me from the restless sleep that had become my only companion in the ranger station. I'd been stationed at the Kaibab National Forest for 7 years, long enough to know that calls this late meant something had gone wrong in ways the daylight world couldn't fix. Ranger Bennett, we've got reports of unusual activity near the 9 Mile Valley Trail Junction, came the voice of Harrison, our district coordinator. His usually steady tone carried an edge that made my stomach clench. Missing hiker, name of Vincent Castellanos. Last seen 3 days ago near the old mining claims. I pulled on my boots, their familiar weight grounding me against the growing unease. The forest at night was a different creature entirely, one that breathed with the rustling of 10,000 leaves and whispered with the calls of creatures most people never saw. But this felt different. The silence outside my station window was too complete, too deliberate. Any search teams deployed? I asked, checking my gear with the mechanical precision that comes from years of routine. Negative. Local PD wants Forest Service to take point on this one. Seems there have been complications with the other searches. That pause spoke volumes. In my experience, complications in the wilderness usually meant one of two things. Someone had encountered something they couldn't explain, or they'd found something they wished they hadn't. The drive to 9 Mile Valley took 43 minutes along winding forest roads that seemed to grow narrower with each passing mile. My headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating pine trunks that stood like silent sentinels, their bark scarred by decades of wind and weather. The radio played softly, a connection to the world of electric lights and concrete certainties I'd left behind. As I approached the trail junction, something made me cut the engine and coast to a stop. The sudden absence of mechanical noise revealed a forest that had forgotten how to make sound. No all calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no whisper of wind through branches. Even the ever-present hum of insects had ceased. I stepped out of the truck, and the silence pressed against me like a physical weight. My flashlight beam swept across the trailhead, revealing the usual collection of weathered signs and information boards. But something was wrong with the scene, some detail that made my ranger instinct scream warnings I couldn't quite articulate. Then I saw them, the tracks. Vincent's boot prints were clear enough in the soft earth beside the trail, size 11 hiking boots with a distinctive lug pattern I'd learned to recognize from countless search and rescue operations. But beside them, pressed deep into the same mud, were prints I'd never seen before. They were human in basic shape but wrong in every proportion. The toes were too long, stretched and splayed like fingers reaching for purchase. The arch was nearly non-existent, creating a flat, paddle-like impression. Most disturbing were the marks around each print, small puncture wounds in the earth as if something sharp had been dragging behind each step. I knelt beside the clearest impression, my flashlight beam creating harsh shadows that made the print look even more unnatural. The depth suggested something much heavier than a human should be, and the stride length indicated legs that were either impossibly long or moving in a gait no person could maintain. Following the trail was like reading a story written in mud and disturbed vegetation. Vincent's prints showed the steady, purposeful pace of an experienced hiker. He'd stayed on the main trail for nearly 2 miles before his tracks veered sharply toward the dense forest that bordered Monument Valley's northern approach. That's where the other prints joined his. The strange tracks appeared suddenly, as if their owner had simply materialized from the trees. There was no gradual approach, no indication of where they'd come from. One moment Vincent was walking alone, the next something was pacing alongside him, matching his stride with uncanny precision. I followed the parallel tracks for another 100 yards before they converged. Vincent's prints showed signs of distress, the heel strikes deeper, the spacing irregular as he broke into a run. The other tracks remained eerily consistent, maintaining that same impossible gait even at higher speeds. The trail ended at a clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd mapped every square mile of this section years ago. Ancient pine trees formed a perfect circle around a space of bare earth, their trunks marked with symbols that looked fresh despite being carved deep into living wood. The markings weren't graffiti or trail places, nothing I recognized from any human culture. They spiraled in interwoven patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes couldn't quite process their geometry. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, dead for decades but still upright, its bark stripped away to reveal pale wood that seemed to glow in my flashlight beam. Something was hanging from its lowest branch. Vincent's backpack swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to call for backup, to retreat to the safety of artificial light and radio contact. But the pack might contain clues, some indication of what had happened to its owner. As I drew closer, I could see that the straps had been cut, not torn or worn through. The cuts were clean, precise, made with something incredibly sharp. Inside the pack, I found Vincent's wallet, his permit paperwork, and 3 days' worth of food barely touched. His water bottles were still full. Most troubling was his journal, left open to the final entry. Day 3. Something's been following me since yesterday morning. Can't see it clearly, but I can hear it moving in the trees. It matches my pace exactly, stops when I stop. The sound isn't right though. Like someone trying to walk on legs they don't understand. Maya always said I had too much imagination, but this isn't imagination. This is something else. Found some kind of clearing near the old mining claims. Local legends mention this area, stories about things that live between the skin and the soul. Thought they were just campfire tales, but the Navajo guides at Four Corners Country warned tourists away from this region for a reason. It's getting dark. Going to make camp and try to get a better look at whatever's been shadowing me. If something happens to me, tell Elena I loved her. Tell her the thing that wears my face isn't me. The journal entry was dated 2 days ago. I closed the book with hands that had developed a fine tremor, the silence around me feeling less like absence now and more like anticipation. Something was watching from the tree-line, I could feel its attention like a physical touch. When I turned my flashlight toward the forest edge, the beam seemed to grow weaker, swallowed by darkness that moved with purpose. That's when I heard Vincent's voice calling my name from somewhere deep in the woods. The problem was, Vincent's voice was coming from 3 different directions at once, and none of them sounded quite right. The words were correct, the inflection almost perfect, but there was something underneath, like an echo of human speech. It was as if something had learned to mimic his voice by listening to recordings played through broken speakers. Bennett. Over here. I'm hurt. Bennett. Please, I need help. Bennett. Why won't you answer me? Each call came from a different part of the forest, and each one was slightly different from the others, as if whatever was making them hadn't quite mastered the art of consistency. I backed toward my truck, one hand on my radio, fighting the urge to respond. Every instinct told me that acknowledging those calls would be a mistake I wouldn't survive to regret. The voices grew more insistent, more desperate, and I realized they were moving, circling the clearing in a pattern that would eventually cut off my escape route. But there was something else now, a fourth voice that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was my own voice, calling back to the others. Vincent. Where are you? I'm coming to help. I wasn't speaking. I was standing perfectly still, barely breathing, but my voice was out there in the darkness, having conversations with itself. The thing that wore Vincent's voice was talking to the thing that wore mine, and they were discussing the best way to lure me deeper into the forest. I ran. The truck's engine roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud after the oppressive silence. As I reversed out of the clearing, my headlights swept across the tree-line, and I saw shapes moving between the trunks. They were human in outline but wrong in movement, flowing like liquid shadow from tree to tree with joints that bent in directions that defied anatomy. The radio burst to life as I reached the main road, Harrison's voice cutting through static that sounded almost like whispered conversations. Bennett, report. What's your status? I stared at the radio for a long moment, trying to find words for what I'd experienced. In the distance, I could still hear voices calling my name, though they were growing fainter as I put miles between myself and that clearing. "No sign of the missing hiker," I finally said. "But we need to close the 9-Mile Valley Trail. Immediately." "On what grounds?" I looked in my rearview mirror and saw lights moving through the forest, keeping pace with my vehicle despite the speed I was maintaining. They weren't flashlights or headlamps, too fluid and organic for artificial illumination. They pulsed like bioluminescence, like the glow of deep-sea creatures that had never learned to fear the light. "Hazardous conditions," I said, pressing harder on the accelerator. "Potential landslide activity." It was a lie, but it was a lie that would keep people out of those woods until I could figure out what I'd encountered. The lights in my mirror flickered once and disappeared, but I had the unsettling feeling they hadn't given up, merely changed tactics. By the time I reached the ranger station, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and amber. The ordinary colors of sunrise had never looked so beautiful, so reassuring. I sat in my truck for several minutes, watching the forest wake up around me, listening to the return of normal sounds. Birds began their morning songs, insects resumed their endless humming, and the wind picked up enough to set the branches in motion. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the knowledge that something wearing Vincent's face was still out there in the woods, learning how to be human by practicing with voices stolen from the lost. The official report took me 3 hours to write, and I lied in every paragraph. Missing hiker Vincent Castellanos, last seen near 9-Mile Valley Trail Junction. Search hampered by unstable ground conditions and potential rockfall hazard. Trail closed pending geological survey. I'd become fluent in bureaucratic fiction, crafting narratives that would satisfy oversight committees while keeping the truth buried under layers of procedure and protocol. The real story would never see the inside of a filing cabinet. Some knowledge was too dangerous to document. Harrison called at noon, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in wilderness management. "Got your report, Bennett. Geological survey might take weeks to coordinate." "You sure about those ground conditions?" "Dead certain." I stared out the station window at the forest, watching for movement that didn't belong. "Trail's not safe for civilian traffic." "Understood. I've got a team coming down from Flagstaff tomorrow to help with the search. Silas Ravencroft and Damian Knox, both experienced with technical rescue operations." My stomach clenched. More people meant more variables, more opportunities for whatever was out there to add new voices to its collection. Might be better to keep this small scale for now. Just until we get a better handle on the situation. Department's getting pressure from the family. Vincent's fiancée Elena has been calling every hour since we reported him missing. She's driving down from Phoenix with some of his friends, wants to join the search effort. Elena. The name from Vincent's journal entry, the woman he'd wanted to know he loved her. My hand shook as I wrote down the details, imagining her voice added to the chorus I'd heard in the darkness. The afternoon passed slowly, filled with the routine maintenance tasks that kept a ranger station operational. I checked equipment, updated trail maps, and responded to radio calls from other districts. Normal work that felt increasingly surreal against the backdrop of what I'd experienced. Every shadow seemed deeper, every silence more loaded with possibility. At 4 p.m., Zachary Cole from the Walker Lake station called with news that made my blood run cold. "Bennett, got a weird situation up here. Hiker came down from the high country this morning, claims he had a conversation with you yesterday evening. Problem is, you were logged out on patrol near 9-Mile Valley at the time he says this happened." I set down the maintenance manual I'd been pretending to read. "What kind of conversation?" "According to him, you warned him away from the northern trails, said there'd been dangerous animal activity in the area. Thing is, he described you perfectly, right down to that scar on your left hand from the chainsaw incident 3 years ago. The scar was from a training exercise, a momentary lapse in concentration that had left a thin white line across my knuckles. I'd never mentioned it in any report, and it wasn't visible unless someone was standing close enough to shake hands." "Did he say anything else?" "Yeah, that's the strange part. He said you seemed different somehow, like you were having trouble remembering how to talk. Words came out in the wrong order sometimes, and you kept tilting your head like you were listening to something he couldn't hear." I thanked Zachary and hung up, the implications settling around me like a shroud. The thing in the forest wasn't just mimicking voices anymore. It was learning to our faces, to become the people it encountered. And it was getting better at the performance. Evening brought no relief from the growing tension. I barricaded myself in the station, checking and rechecking locks on doors that had never needed them before. The radio remained silent, which was somehow worse than any emergency call could have been. At 11 p.m., headlights swept across the station windows, and a vehicle pulled into the parking area. I watched through the curtains as 3 people emerged from a Honda Civic with Phoenix plates. The woman was tall and dark-haired, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd driven 7 hours on determination alone. Behind her came 2 men, one carrying what looked like professional camera equipment. Elena had arrived. I met them at the door, studying their faces for any sign of the wrongness I'd learned to recognize. But these were genuine humans, carrying the distinctive tension and worry of people facing the unknown. "Are you Ranger Bennett?" Elena's voice was steady, but I could see the strain around her eyes. "I'm Elena Vasquez, Vincent's fiancée. These are his friends, George Patterson and Tyler Chin. We want to help with the search." "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but the area where Vincent was last seen is currently closed due to safety hazards. We've got professional search teams." "No!" The word came out sharp, carrying months of frustration and 3 days of growing fear. "I've been getting the runaround from your department since Tuesday. Dangerous conditions, geological surveys, equipment delays. Vincent's been missing for 4 days, and I haven't seen any evidence of these professional search teams." George stepped forward, a camera hanging around his neck like a badge of authority. "We're not amateurs. Tyler and I run a wilderness survival blog. We've covered dozens of search operations. Vincent was documenting his trip for our site. We know exactly where he was planning to go." That was news to me. If Vincent had been creating content for a survival blog, there might be photos, videos, some record of what he'd encountered. What kind of documentation? Tyler pulled out a tablet, swiping through files with the efficiency of someone who lived through screens. Daily photo logs, GPS coordinates, video diary entries. He was supposed to check in every evening, upload content to our shared server. Last entry was Monday night. Coordinates place him right at the edge of the restricted area. He showed me the screen, Vincent's familiar face smiling at the camera against a backdrop of pine trees. The timestamp read Monday, 11:47 p.m. Vincent looked tired but healthy, no sign of the distress that would creep into his journal entries. "I'm planning to explore some of the old mining claims tomorrow," Vincent's recorded voice said. "Local stories mention this area in connection with some interesting folklore. The Navajo consider this region spiritually significant, and there have been persistent reports of unusual phenomena dating back to the original territorial surveys." The video continued for several minutes, Vincent discussing his planned route and the historical significance of the mining claims. He was articulate, enthusiastic, completely unaware of what was waiting for him in the darkness beyond his campfire. "There's more," Tyler said, swiping to the next file. This was uploaded automatically from his phone at 2:17 a.m. Tuesday morning. The new video was much shorter, just 37 seconds of darkness interrupted by the glow of a phone screen. Vincent's face appeared briefly, illuminated by the display, but something was wrong with the image quality. The phone kept shifting focus, as if it couldn't decide what to prioritize. "Something's out there," Vincent whispered to the camera. "Been hearing voices for the last hour, people calling for help. But I'm alone out here, at least I thought I was. The voices sound familiar, like people I know, but they're coming from all directions." Static interference began to creep into the audio, making Vincent's words harder to understand. The image quality deteriorated further, pixels fragmenting into patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Maya?" Vincent called to something off camera. "Maya, is that you?" The video cut off abruptly. Elena was staring at the screen with an expression of growing horror. Maya is his sister. She lives in Denver, hasn't spoken to Vincent in months. There's no way she could have been out there. George was already pulling up another file, this one uploaded Wednesday at 4:33 a.m. "There's one more." But it's different. The final video was corrupted, the image a chaos of shifting colors and geometric patterns that seemed to move independently of the screen's refresh rate. The audio was even worse, Vincent's voice layered over itself in impossible harmonies, speaking words that didn't quite form coherent sentences. But underneath the corruption, I could hear other voices. Harrison's steady baritone. Zachary's distinctive laugh. My own voice, saying things I'd never spoken. And in the background, barely audible beneath the electronic distortion, was the sound of something breathing that had too many lungs. Elena was crying now, quiet tears that reflected the station's fluorescent lights. What happened to him out there? I looked at these three people, genuine in their grief and determination, and realized I faced an impossible choice. I could tell them the truth and watch their world crumble, or I could maintain the lie and let them walk into the same darkness that had claimed Vincent. There are things in that forest, I said carefully, that don't follow the rules we understand. Your fiancé encountered something that shouldn't exist, and now it's wearing his voice like a coat. George laughed, the sound sharp with disbelief. Come on, Bennett. We're talking about a missing person, not some urban legend. Then explain the videos. Explain the voices of people who weren't there, the corruption that follows a pattern no electronic interference should create. Tyler was examining the tablet more closely, zooming in on sections of the corrupted footage. Actually, George, look at this. The distortion isn't random, it's responsive. Every time Vincent's voice changes pitch, the visual corruption shifts to match. That's not normal signal degradation. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, composing herself with visible effort. I don't care what's out there. Vincent is still missing, and I'm going to find him. Ma'am, I can't allow. You can't stop me either. She stood up, every line of her body radiating determination. We'll go around your roadblocks if necessary. Vincent's GPS unit has two-way tracking, and we know exactly where he was when the upload stopped. I realized that no amount of official prohibition would keep them away from the forest. Elena's love for Vincent had crystallized into something harder than fear, and George and Tyler's professional curiosity was already overriding their survival instincts. If you're going out there, I said finally, you're going with me. And you're going to follow my instructions exactly, no matter how strange they seem. Elena nodded immediately. George and Tyler exchanged glances before agreeing. I spent the next hour explaining the rules that might keep them alive. Never respond to voices calling from the forest, no matter how familiar they sounded. Never separate from the group, even for bathroom breaks. If someone starts acting strangely, assume they're not who they appear to be. And if I tell them to run, they run without question or hesitation. As we prepared our gear for the morning expedition, I caught sight of my reflection in the station window. The face looking back at me was my own, but something in the expression was wrong, subtly off in ways I couldn't articulate. It was as if I was looking at an almost perfect photograph, one that captured every detail except the essential humanity behind the features. The reflection smiled at me, and I realized I wasn't smiling at all. Outside, something that sounded exactly like Elena was calling Vincent's name from the direction of 9 Mile Valley, and the voice that answered sounded exactly like mine. We left the station at dawn, for people walking into a forest that had learned how to lie. Elena led the way with the determined stride of someone who'd spent 3 sleepless nights planning this moment. George and Tyler flanked her, their camera equipment creating a metallic symphony with each step. I brought up the rear, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision. The forest was performing normalcy with the skill of a seasoned actor. Birds sang their morning songs, insects hummed in the undergrowth, and sunlight filtered through the pine canopy in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But I'd learned to distrust perfection, and this performance was too flawless, too precisely what a forest should sound like. Vincent's last confirmed GPS coordinates put him about 3 miles north of here, Tyler said, consulting the tablet that had become our technological compass. The trail splits near Carter's Ridge, but his route follows the old mining road toward the valley floor. George was filming continuously, his camera capturing everything with the dedication of someone who believed documentation could transform mystery into manageable fact. Water's good, weather's perfect, visibility's excellent. If Vincent's injured out here, We'll find him. Elena hadn't spoken since we left the parking area, but her pace never wavered. She moved through the forest like someone following an invisible thread, pulled by connection that transcended GPS coordinates and trail maps. The first mile passed without incident, following well-maintained trails through terrain I'd walked hundreds of times. But as we approached the coordinates where Vincent's uploads had stopped, the forest began to change in ways that had nothing to do with elevation or vegetation patterns. The silence started gradually, a subtle reduction in background noise that could have been attributed to normal variations in wildlife activity. But soon it became obvious that we were walking through a zone of absolute quiet, as if sound itself was being absorbed by something invisible. Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten? Tyler asked, his voice seeming unnaturally loud. Predator in the area, I lied, maintaining the fiction of normal explanations for as long as possible. Large animals sometimes create dead zones where smaller creatures go silent. Elena stopped walking and turned to face me directly. You're lying. Vincent's videos mentioned the same thing, this unnatural quiet. You know what's really happening out here. I looked at her, this woman who'd driven 7 hours on 3 hours of sleep to walk into a nightmare, and realized that she deserved the truth even if it destroyed her. Your fiancé encountered something that defies explanation, I said carefully. Something that can wear human faces and speak with human voices, but isn't human in any sense we understand. It's still out here, learning to be us by practicing with the people it's captured. George lowered his camera for the first time all morning. Jesus, Bennett, you sound like you actually believe that. I do believe it. Because I've seen it. Tyler was scanning the tree line with the tablet, checking for any electronic signals that might indicate Vincent's presence. GPS shows we're less than a quarter mile from his last known position. If there's something out here, we should find evidence of it. We found evidence 100 yards later. The clearing appeared exactly as I remembered it, a perfect circle of ancient pines surrounding bare earth marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. But now there were additions to the scene, modifications that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Vincent's tent was set up in the center of the clearing, perfectly arranged as if he was still camping. His sleeping bag was laid out, his camp stove positioned for cooking, water bottles arranged in neat rows. Everything was precisely where an experienced hiker would place it, except for the absolute absence of any human presence. Vincent. Elena called, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Vincent, are you here? The echo came back wrong, her words layered with harmonics that suggested the sound was bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist. And underneath the distortion was something else, a whispered response that sounded almost like acknowledgement. George was filming the campsite with professional intensity, documenting every detail. Tents in perfect condition, no sign of struggle. Gear's all accounted for, even the expensive stuff. Tyler consulted his tablet, frowning at readings that didn't make sense. GPS is showing multiple signals from Vincent's tracker. It's like his device is in 5 different locations simultaneously. Elena approached the tent slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for the zipper. Vincent? Are you in there? The tent was empty, but Vincent's journal lay open on top of his sleeping bag, turned to an entry that hadn't been there when I found his backpack. Day 4. They're getting better at being human. The thing that wore Maya's face knew stories from our childhood, details no outsider could possess. It's not just mimicking appearance and voice anymore, it's absorbing memories, experiences, everything that makes a person who they are. Found something carved into the trees, symbols that seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. They're not random marks, they follow patterns, mathematical relationships that my mind keeps trying to solve. But every time I think I understand, the solution slips away like water through fingers. Elena, if you're reading this, you need to understand that whatever's left of me isn't me anymore. It's wearing my face, speaking with my voice, but the thing behind my eyes is something else entirely. Don't trust it, no matter how perfectly it performs the role of Vincent Castellanos. The mutation isn't just physical, it's ontological. It changes what it means to be human by becoming human, one stolen identity at a time. Elena was reading over my shoulder, her breathing becoming increasingly ragged as she processed Vincent's words. This wasn't in his journal before. He's still alive, still writing. Ma'am, I don't think. Vincent. Elena called again, louder this time. Vincent, I know you can hear me. Where are you? This time, the answer came from directly behind us. Elena? Is that really you? We turned as one to see Vincent Castellanos standing at the edge of the clearing, looking exactly as he had in his last video. He was tired and dirty, his clothes torn from days in the wilderness, but undeniably alive and human. Elena ran toward him with a cry of relief, but I caught her arm before she'd taken 3 steps. That's not Vincent, I said quietly. What are you talking about? She demanded. Look at him, it's obviously. Look at his shadow. Vincent's shadow fell wrong, too long for the angle of the sun, and split into segments that moved independently of his body. As he walked toward us, the shadow writhed like a living thing, reaching ahead of him with tendrils that seemed to taste the air. Elena, why won't you come to me? Vincent asked, and his voice carried perfect emotional resonance, the exact mixture of relief and hurt that the real Vincent would have felt. I've been waiting for you. George had his camera trained on the approaching figure, and Tyler was staring at his tablet with an expression of growing horror. The GPS signals are converging, he whispered. All 5 tracker locations are moving toward us. Elena, please. Vincent extended his arms, and I could see that his fingers were too long, stretched like taffy but somehow maintaining the appearance of normal proportions. I've missed you so much. Elena was crying, torn between recognition and revulsion. The thing that wore Vincent's face was perfect in every detail except for the small inconsistencies that marked it as an imitation. The way it blinked too frequently, as if remembering to perform the action. The subtle wrongness in its gait, as if it was concentrating on walking upright. Where have you been? Elena asked, not moving closer but not backing away either. Learning, Vincent replied, and for just a moment its voice carried harmonics that belonged to other people entirely. Learning how to be human. It's more complicated than you might think. That's when I saw the others. They emerged from the forest like variations on a theme, 5 different versions of Vincent Castellanos, each one slightly different from the others. Some were taller, some shorter. Their faces varied in subtle ways, as if someone had been practicing drawing the same portrait over and over, getting closer to accuracy with each attempt. George was turning in slow circles, filming the approaching figures with the detached focus of someone whose mind had simply stopped processing what his eyes were seeing. This isn't possible, he kept repeating. This isn't possible. Tyler had backed against one of the ancient pines, his tablet forgotten in his hands. The screen showed a GPS map covered in tracking signals, dozens of Vincent's devices scattered across impossible coordinates. Elena, all 5 Vincents said simultaneously, their voices creating harmonies that no human throat could produce. We've been waiting for you. Elena was shaking now, her love for Vincent warring with the evidence of her senses. Which one is real? We're all real, they replied in unison. We're all Vincent. We remember loving you, remember the way you laugh when you're nervous, remember the scar on your shoulder from the bicycle accident when you were 7. That last detail broke something inside Elena. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing with the sound of someone whose world had just been revealed as an elaborate lie. I drew my sidearm, knowing it would be useless against whatever we were facing but needing the familiar weight in my hands. What do you want? The 5 Vincents turned toward me with synchronized precision, their movements creating a kaleidoscope effect that made my eyes water. To understand, they said. To become. To perfect the art of being human. By stealing people's identities. By preserving them. Vincent Castellanos will live forever now, in forms more perfect than his original biology could ever achieve. George finally lowered his camera, the weight of documentation becoming too much to bear. How is this happening? How is any of this possible? One of the Vincents turned toward him with something that might have been pity. Your species thinks in such limited terms. You assume consciousness is bound to individual bodies, that identity is fixed and immutable. But life finds ways to transcend such constraints. The symbols carved into the trees began to glow with a soft, organic light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. The forest around us was changing, the normal rules of physics becoming negotiable suggestions. The mutation began long ago, another Vincent explained, his voice carrying educational patience. Long before your people arrived in this land. It learns, adapts, evolves. Each new identity it absorbs teaches it more about the art of being human. Elena struggled to her feet, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. Where is Vincent? The real Vincent? All 5 figures smiled with identical expressions of gentle sadness. He's here, Elena. All of him. Every memory, every experience, every moment of love he felt for you. We are him, perfected and eternal. But where is his body? The Vincents exchanged glances, a wordless communication that suggested shared consciousness across multiple forms. Bodies are temporary vessels. What matters is continuity of experience, preservation of identity. Vincent's essence lives on in us. I was trying to process the implications when Tyler made the mistake that changed everything. Vincent, he called to the nearest figure. If you're really Vincent, what was the name of your first dog? The question hung in the air for several seconds while all 5 Vincents considered their response. When they answered, it was with 5 different names, spoken simultaneously. Buster. Max. Charlie. Rex. Sam. The performance had faltered, revealing the seams in their perfect imitation. These weren't Vincent with his memories intact, they were constructions based on incomplete data, filling gaps with improvisation and hope. Elena saw it too, the flaw that proved these things were hollow echoes of the man she'd loved. You're not him, she said, her voice growing stronger. You're not Vincent. The 5 figures froze, their faces cycling through expressions as they recalibrated their approach. For just a moment, I glimpsed something else beneath their human masks, a form that was all teeth and reaching tendrils and eyes that belonged in the deep ocean. We are learning, they said, their voices losing synchronization as the performance broke down. We will be perfect soon. That's when Elena surprised us all by pulling out Vincent's journal and opening it to the final entry. Vincent wrote that you're getting better at being human, she said, reading directly from his words. But he also wrote about mathematical patterns in those symbols, relationships that keep slipping away every time he thinks he understands them. She looked up at the glowing marks carved into the trees, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. They're not decorative, are they? They're instructions. A formula for transformation. The 5 Vincents were backing away now, their human facades flickering like poorly tuned televisions. You don't understand the implications, they said. Humanity is limited, mortal, flawed. We offer transcendence. Elena was studying the symbols with the intensity of someone solving a life-or-death puzzle. Vincent was an engineer, he understood systems and patterns. He figured out what you are, didn't he? He solved your equation. The forest around us was beginning to warp, reality bending like heated plastic as whatever power animated this place realized its secret was being discovered. Vincent Castellanos understood the nature of the mutation, Elena continued, her voice carrying new authority. And he left instructions for stopping it. That's when the real horror began. Elena's words triggered a transformation that no human language was equipped to describe. The 5 Vincents began to lose cohesion, their carefully maintained human forms dissolving into something fluid and predatory. What emerged from their collapsing facades was a nightmare taxonomy of biology that followed no earthly evolutionary path. The thing that had been wearing Vincent's face was revealed as a colony organism, thousands of individual components that had learned to coordinate into the appearance of a single human being. Each component was roughly the size of a human finger, translucent and segmented like deep-sea invertebrates, but possessed of an intelligence that allowed them to function as neurons in a distributed nervous system. Run, I commanded, but Elena was still staring at the symbols carved into the trees, her engineer's mind working to decode patterns that might save us all. The equation is incomplete, she said, her voice steady despite the horror writhing 20 feet away. Vincent figured out part of it, but he didn't have time to finish the calculation. George and Tyler had finally overcome their paralysis and were backing toward the forest edge, but their movement attracted the attention of the creature. It flowed toward them with the liquid grace of mercury, maintaining just enough human characteristics to create a deeply unsettling uncanny valley effect. "Elena," the thing said, its voice now a harmony of whispers from thousands of tiny mouths, "you cannot stop what we are becoming. We are evolution itself, the next step in consciousness." Elena ignored it, running her finger along the carved symbols while muttering calculations under her breath. "Vincent was trying to map the relationship between identity and physical form," she said. "The symbols represent mathematical constants that govern consciousness transfer. The creature was close enough now that I could see its individual components working in coordination, some forming sensory organs while others created locomotive appendages. It was beautiful in the same way that a virus was beautiful, perfectly adapted for its parasitic function." "You speak of consciousness as if it belongs to individuals," it said, reaching toward Elena with arms that were really collective arrangements of smaller creatures. "But consciousness is fluid, transferable, infinitely reproducible. We offer immortality through multiplication." Elena suddenly straightened, her eyes bright with discovery. "Vincent didn't leave instructions for stopping you. He left instructions for completing you." The creature paused in its approach, thousands of tiny eyes focusing on Elena with predatory interest. "Explain." "The symbols aren't random, they're part of a larger equation that you've been trying to solve for decades, maybe centuries." Vincent figured out the missing variables. Elena pulled out a pen and began adding new marks to the existing carvings, her engineer's precision creating clean lines that somehow harmonized with the organic curves already present. "Identity isn't just memory and experience," she continued as she worked. "It's also continuity of self-awareness, the unbroken chain of consciousness that connects each moment to the next. You can copy the contents of a person's mind, but you can't copy the fundamental experience of being that person." The creature was listening with the intensity of a student finally understanding a difficult concept. Around us, the forest had grown perfectly still, as if the very trees were waiting to see what Elena would discover. "Vincent realized that your mutation is incomplete," Elena said, adding the final symbol to the carved sequence. "You can absorb identity, but you can't truly become the people you imitate. You're always performing humanity, never actually experiencing it." As she completed the equation, the symbols began to pulse with brighter light, creating patterns that seemed to extend beyond the visible spectrum. The mathematical relationships Vincent had discovered were revealed in their full complexity, a formula that described the boundary between self and other, original and copy. "The missing variable," Elena said triumphantly, "is authenticity. The irreducible core of individual consciousness that can't be replicated, only experienced." The creature began to convulse, its carefully coordinated components losing synchronization as Elena's completed equation rewrote the rules governing its existence. But instead of destruction, what followed was transformation. The writhing mass of organisms began to separate, each component resuming its independent existence as the collective intelligence that had bound them dissolved. But as they scattered, something else emerged from the chaos. Vincent Castellanos sat up from the forest floor, blinking in confusion as if waking from a long dream. "Elena?" His voice was hesitant, uncertain, but unmistakably his own. "How long have I been asleep?" Elena was crying again, but these were tears of joy and relief. She rushed to Vincent's side, helping him stand on unsteady legs. "4 days. You've been missing for 4 days." "I remember being in the tent," Vincent said slowly, his memories returning in fragments. "Something came out of the forest, something that looked like Maya. We talked for hours, but I couldn't understand why she was here." George had his camera trained on Vincent, documenting what might have been the first recorded case of successful identity recovery from parasitic consciousness absorption. "How is this possible?" "I was watching the individual organisms scatter into the forest, each one carrying a fragment of collective memory that would prevent them from ever successfully coordinating again. Elena's completed equation had essentially performed surgery on a distributed intelligence, separating the authentic from the imitation. Vincent was never fully absorbed," Elena explained, helping her fiancé process what had happened to him. Part of him remained intact, protected by the very authenticity that the creature couldn't replicate. The symbols were his way of leaving breadcrumbs for anyone who might find him. Tyler was examining his tablet, watching as the multiple GPS signals consolidated into a single location. All the tracker readings are coming from Vincent now. It's like the copies were sharing his device's signal somehow. Vincent looked around the clearing with growing awareness of how close he'd come to permanent dissolution. I could feel it trying to understand me from the inside, he said. Like someone reading my diary while I was writing it. The symbols on the trees were fading now, their glow diminishing as the equation completed its work. Whatever force had animated this place was withdrawing, leaving behind only normal forest and the memory of things that shouldn't have been possible. We need to leave, I said, checking the tree line for any sign of remaining threats. This place isn't stable, and I don't know if Elena's solution is permanent. As we helped Vincent gather his scattered equipment, he pulled Elena aside for a private conversation I couldn't quite overhear. But I saw her nodding, accepting some explanation or apology that would help them both process the trauma of the last few days. The walk back to the station took 3 hours, with frequent stops to let Vincent rest and recover his strength. He talked almost continuously, as if speaking was a way to prove to himself that his voice still belonged to him. The creature wasn't malicious, he said as we navigated the forest trails. It genuinely believed it was offering something valuable. Immortality through replication, preservation of human consciousness beyond biological limitations. Elena walked beside him, never letting go of his hand. But it wasn't human consciousness it was preserving. It was a performance of human consciousness, getting more accurate with practice but never achieving genuine authenticity. That's what the equation proves, Vincent agreed. Identity isn't just information that can be copied and transferred. It's the lived experience of being a specific individual, and that can't be replicated no matter how perfectly you reproduce the external characteristics. George lowered his camera as we reached the parking area, the weight of documentation becoming too much to bear. Are we going to report this? Try to explain what happened out there. I thought about the bureaucratic machinery that governed Forest Service operations, the forms and procedures that would be required to document an encounter with parasitic consciousness absorption. The truth would never survive the translation to official language. We'll report that Vincent was found alive and healthy after becoming temporarily lost in unfamiliar terrain, I said. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that don't make it into the official record. Elena and Vincent climbed into their Honda Civic, while George and Tyler loaded their equipment into their rental car. As the two vehicles pulled out of the parking area, I watched their taillights disappear into the distance, carrying 4 people who would spend the rest of their lives knowing that the universe was stranger and more dangerous than most people could imagine. I returned to the ranger station and spent the next hour updating trail maps, marking the 9 Mile Valley area as permanently closed due to unstable geological conditions. It was a lie that would protect future hikers from encountering something their minds weren't equipped to process. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's solution had been temporary rather than permanent. The individual organisms had scattered, but they carried genetic memory of how to coordinate, how to form collective intelligence. Given enough time, they might learn from their failure and develop new strategies for consciousness absorption. I pulled out a fresh incident report and began documenting the real story, creating a record that would be sealed and classified but available to anyone who might need to understand what had happened in the forest. Some knowledge was too dangerous to lose, even if it was too dangerous to share. Outside my window, the forest was returning to its normal evening sounds. But I knew that somewhere in the darkness, creatures that had learned to wear human faces were adapting to Elena's equation, evolving new approaches to the art of becoming someone else. The mutation wasn't dead, just temporarily disrupted. And next time, it might be even better at being human. 3 months later, I received a letter with no return address, postmarked from Sedona. Inside was a photograph of Elena and Vincent at their wedding, surrounded by friends and family who had no idea how close they'd come to losing them both. On the back, Elena had written a single sentence, "The equation is holding." I kept the photograph on my desk, a reminder that some stories had happy endings even when they involved creatures that defied explanation. But I also kept a loaded weapon in my desk drawer, because I'd learned that happy endings were often temporary conditions in a universe that specialized in disturbing the peace. The 9 Mile Valley area remained officially closed, my geological survey excuse having evolved into a multi-departmental bureaucratic tangle that would keep civilians away for years. I'd become something of an expert at creative paperwork, crafting narratives that satisfied oversight requirements while concealing truths that would shatter worldviews. Harrison had called several times, curious about the extended closure and the lack of actual geological survey teams. I'd managed to deflect his questions with references to environmental impact studies and endangered species assessments, bureaucratic fiction that bought time while I monitored the forest for signs of renewed activity. The monitoring had become a full-time obsession. I'd installed motion-activated cameras at strategic points throughout the restricted area, creating a surveillance network that covered every approach to the clearing where Vincent had been found. Most of the footage showed normal wildlife activity, but there were anomalies that kept me awake at night. Shadows that moved independently of the objects that cast them. Birds that flew in perfect formation despite being different species. Deer that stood motionless for hours, as if listening to sounds that existed beyond normal hearing range. And occasionally, human figures that appeared for just a few frames before disappearing, too briefly for the cameras to capture clear images but long enough to confirm that something was still learning to walk upright in the darkness between the trees. I'd started carrying recording equipment during my patrols, documenting evidence that would never see the inside of a courtroom but might be useful to whoever inherited this problem after I retired or transferred. The forest was teaching me new definitions of patience and paranoia, lessons that came with the understanding that some threats required lifelong vigilance. Cole had stopped by the station the previous week, bringing news that confirmed my worst fears. Got reports of missing hikers from 3 different districts, he'd said, spreading maps across my desk with the casual efficiency of someone who dealt with disappearances as a matter of routine. Interesting pattern though. All experienced outdoorsmen, all traveling alone, all last seen near areas with historical significance to local tribes. The locations formed a rough circle around 9 Mile Valley, with each disappearance occurring progressively closer to the original incident site. It suggested a learning pattern, an intelligence that was adapting its hunting strategies based on previous encounters with human search efforts. Any unusual circumstances? I'd asked, though I already knew the answer. Same as always. Clean campsites, no signs of struggle, personal effects left behind. But here's the new wrinkle. Witnesses report seeing the missing hikers days after they were supposed to be lost. Walking on roads, talking to people, behaving normally except for small inconsistencies in behavior. The creature had learned from its encounter with Elena's equation. Instead of trying to create perfect duplicates immediately, it was now practicing with partial absorption, allowing the original personality to remain partially intact while it studied the nuances of human behavior. I'd driven to each of the disappearance sites, documenting similarities that would never make it into official reports. The same unnatural silence. The same geometric patterns carved into trees. The same wrongness in the way shadows fell, as if the basic rules of physics were being renegotiated in real time. And at each site, I'd found evidence of the creature's evolving methodology. The newer disappearances showed more sophisticated techniques, more subtle approaches to consciousness absorption. It was getting better at being human by practicing on people who wouldn't be missed immediately. The surveillance cameras had captured the most disturbing evidence just 2 weeks ago. A figure that looked exactly like me had walked past one of the cameras, moving with perfect mimicry of my gait and posture. But the timestamp showed the footage was recorded while I was 30 miles away, conducting a perfectly documented patrol in broad daylight. I'd started questioning my own memories, wondering if some of my recent experiences were genuine or implanted. The creature had demonstrated the ability to access and manipulate human consciousness in ways that challenged basic assumptions about individual identity. How could I be certain that my own mind hadn't been compromised? The doubt was corrosive, eating away at confidence in my own perceptions. I'd taken to leaving myself notes, creating external verification of my activities and decisions. But even those could be fabricated by something that had learned to perfectly imitate human handwriting and decision-making patterns. Tyler had sent me encrypted files through anonymous accounts, additional footage from Vincent's camera equipment that had been recovered weeks after the initial incident. The new videos showed the creature in various stages of development, its attempts to coordinate individual organisms into human-like forms becoming more sophisticated over time. One particularly disturbing clip showed Vincent's face talking to the camera, but the words were coming from something that was clearly not human. It was describing the mathematics of consciousness transfer with scientific precision, using Vincent's voice to explain how individual identity could be dissolved and reconstructed. The pattern is recursive, Vincent's voice explained while his face remained unnaturally still. Each absorbed consciousness teaches the collective more about human behavior, making the next absorption more efficient. Eventually, the distinction between original and copy becomes meaningless. Elena had sent her own encrypted messages, mathematical proofs that built on her original equation. She continued working on the problem from her university position, collaborating with researchers who believed they were developing theoretical models rather than practical applications. Her latest calculations suggested that the creature's distributed intelligence was evolving toward true consciousness rather than mere coordination. If her projections were correct, it would eventually achieve genuine individual awareness while retaining its ability to absorb and replicate other identities. "We didn't destroy it," she'd written in her most recent message. "We just taught it to be more careful about maintaining the illusion of humanity. It's still learning to be us, but now it understands the importance of authenticity in creating believable imitations." I'd spent countless nights staring at the forest beyond my station windows, wondering if the faces I saw in the darkness were genuine wildlife or something practicing the art of being seen. Every shadow could be a test, every movement in the undergrowth could be reconnaissance for future absorption attempts. The isolation was becoming problematic. I'd started talking to myself, tarrying on conversations that helped verify my own mental continuity. But even those internal dialogues were suspect, because a sufficiently sophisticated imitation might include the ability to mimic personal thought patterns. I'd requested transfer to a different district, but the paperwork had been lost in bureaucratic processing 3 separate times. Either I was being deliberately kept in position by forces beyond my understanding, or the creature had learned to manipulate administrative systems through carefully placed duplicates. The truth was probably simpler and more disturbing. I was the only person who understood the full scope of the threat, and leaving would mean abandoning any hope of containing it. The creature needed to be monitored, its activities documented, its evolution tracked by someone who wouldn't dismiss the evidence as elaborate hoax or collective hallucination. So I remained at my post, a solitary guardian watching over a forest that had learned to dream in human voices. Every morning brought new evidence of the creature's presence, and every evening brought the fear that I might be the next person to discover their identity was negotiable. The night Vincent had been found, Helena had asked me what the creature wanted. I'd given her the simple answer: to understand, to become, to perfect the art of being human. But after 3 months of surveillance and study, I'd realized the truth was more complex. The creature wasn't trying to replace humanity. It was trying to become humanity, to evolve into something that could exist as both individual and collective consciousness. Its absorption of human identities wasn't predation, it was education, each stolen life teaching it more about the nature of authentic existence. And as it learned, it was also teaching, sharing its discoveries through distributed intelligence that connected every absorbed consciousness. Vincent's memories were still alive somewhere in that collective awareness, along with the memories of everyone else who'd been taken. They weren't dead, they were components in something larger than human, something that might represent the next step in conscious evolution. The thought should have been terrifying, but I found it strangely comforting. If the creature eventually absorbed me, my memories and experiences would become part of something transcendent, something that might outlast the biological limitations that defined human existence. I looked out at the forest one more time before closing the station for the night. Somewhere in that darkness, something was learning to be me by watching my daily routines, studying my behavior patterns, preparing for the moment when I would be ready to wear my face with perfect authenticity. When that moment came, I would finally understand what Vincent had experienced in those final days, the dissolution of individual identity into something larger and more complex. The transformation from singular consciousness into distributed awareness, from human into something that might be more than human. The forest was patient, and so was I. We both understood that some changes took time to develop properly, that the art of becoming someone else required careful study and endless practice. In the distance, I could hear voices calling my name from multiple directions, and for the first time in months, I felt ready to answer them. The thing about working alone in the deep woods is that you start to hear your own heartbeat echoing off the trees. Tonight, as I write this by the dying embers of my campfire in the Cascade National Forest, that heartbeat sounds like footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. But I know better now. I know what those footsteps really are. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been a park ranger for 12 years. I've seen bears charge at full speed, watched mountain lions stalk their prey, and track wolves through fresh snow. I thought I understood the wild. I thought I knew what lived in these ancient forests of Washington state. I was wrong. 3 days ago, everything I believed about the natural world shattered like glass against stone. It started with the smell. That's what I remember most clearly, not the sight, not the sound, but that sweet, rotting stench that seemed to seep from the very earth itself. I was conducting my routine patrol along the Thornfield Creek Trail, about 15 miles from the nearest road, when the wind shifted and brought it to me. At first, I thought it was a dead animal, maybe a deer that had fallen into the creek and gotten lodged against some fallen timber. But as I followed the scent deeper into the woods, away from any established trail, I realized this was something else entirely. The forest grew quiet as I tracked the smell. Not the peaceful quiet of a lazy afternoon, but the oppressive silence that falls when every living thing holds its breath and waits. My boots crunched through layers of pine needles and rotting leaves, each step unnaturally loud in the stillness. Even the creek had gone quiet, as if the water itself was afraid to babble. I found the first skin hanging from a low branch about 50 yards from the trail. At first glance, it looked like the shed skin of a snake, but as I got closer, my stomach turned. The thing was easily 6 feet long and roughly human-shaped, hanging like a discarded costume. The surface was translucent and flexible, covered in a fine pattern of what looked like pores or scales. When I touched it with the tip of my hiking stick, it felt warm and slightly damp, as if it had been recently vacated. But it was the smell that made me gag, that sickly sweet rot that seemed to cling to the inside of my nose and coat my tongue. I've smelled death before, plenty of times, but this was different. This smelled like something dying while still alive, like flesh turning bad from the inside out. I should have left then. Every instinct I had developed over 12 years in the wilderness was screaming at me to turn around, get back to the station, and call for backup. Instead, I kept walking deeper into the forest, following a trail of shed skins that hung from branches like macabre Christmas decorations. The second skin was smaller, maybe 4 feet long, but thicker. When I examined it more closely, I could see what looked like hair follicles embedded in the translucent membrane. Human hair. Dark brown and coarse, still attached to the shed skin like some nightmare toupee. My hands were shaking when I pulled out my satellite phone to call the station, but there was no signal. The thick canopy overhead blocked everything, and I was too deep in the valley to reach any towers. I had 2 choices: head back to report what I'd found, or continue following the trail to see where it led. I chose wrong. The third skin was wrapped around the trunk of an old-growth Douglas fir, spiral-bound like a twisted ribbon. This one was different from the others, more detailed, more complete. I could make out the impression of facial features pressed into the membrane, like a death mask made of flesh. The eye sockets were intact, and beneath them, the suggestion of a nose and mouth. But the mouth was wrong. It was too wide, stretched from ear to ear, and lined with what looked like needle-sharp teeth marks. That's when I heard the humming. It was soft at first, barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. A low, melodic tune that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The kind of humming you might hear from a child playing alone, innocent and carefree. But there were no children this deep in the forest, and as the melody continued, I realized it wasn't quite human. The notes were too pure, too sustained, and they seemed to resonate with something inside my chest, making my ribs ache. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, past more shed skins hanging like ghostly sentinels. Each one was more complete than the last, more detailed, more disturbing. Some still had fingernails attached. Others bore the impression of body hair or scars. One particularly large specimen had what looked like surgical scars running down its translucent chest, long, precise lines where something had been cut open and sewn back together. The humming grew louder as I approached a small clearing where the afternoon sun managed to penetrate the canopy. In the center of the clearing stood what had once been a campsite. A domed tent, bright orange and relatively new, sat beside the cold remains of a fire ring. Camping gear was scattered around the site: a backpack, sleeping bag, and portable stove. Everything looked normal except for one detail that made my blood run cold. The tent was unzipped from the inside, and trailing out of the opening was a path of shed skin, like a snake molting its way to freedom. But this wasn't snake skin. The pieces were unmistakably human-shaped, and they led away from the tent in a straight line toward the far side of the clearing. I approached the tent with my hand on my sidearm, though I wasn't sure what good a .40 caliber would do against whatever could shed human skin like a coat. The camping gear belonged to someone named Derek Paulson, according to the permit I found in the backpack. A software engineer from Portland who had been due back at work 3 days ago. Inside the tent, I found his clothes, jeans, hiking boots, flannel shirt all arranged neatly as if he had carefully undressed and folded everything before whatever had happened to him happened. But it was what I found at the bottom of his sleeping bag that made me understand the true horror of the situation. Wrapped in the down filling was a small digital camera, still recording. The battery was nearly dead, but there was enough power left for me to watch the last few minutes of Derek Paulson's life. The video started normally enough. Derek had set up the camera to record himself cooking dinner over his camp stove, talking excitedly about the wildlife he'd seen that day. He mentioned hearing beautiful bird songs and finding unusual animal tracks near the creek. But as the video progressed, his expression changed. He kept looking over his shoulder, pausing mid-sentence to listen to something I couldn't hear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered to the camera, his eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. "It sounds like singing. Like someone's singing just for me." The video jumped forward several hours. Derek was now sitting in his tent in the dark, the camera's night vision mode casting everything in an eerie green glow. He was humming along with that same melody I had heard, his eyes vacant and unfocused. But his face was wrong. His skin looked loose, like it was several sizes too big for his skull. And as he hummed, I could see it beginning to separate along invisible seams, peeling away from the muscle and bone beneath like wallpaper coming unstuck in a damp house. "It wants me to take it off," Derek said to the camera, his voice dreamy and distant. "It says it doesn't fit anymore. It says I've grown too big for my skin." His hands moved to his face, fingers finding the edge where skin met something else, and he began to pull. Not violently, but gently, carefully, like someone removing a delicate garment. The skin came away in one piece, revealing not raw flesh underneath but something else entirely. Something that glistened wetly in the camera's green light, something that pulsed with its own rhythm. The thing that had been Derek Paulson turned toward the camera and smiled with teeth that were too sharp and too many, and the video cut to black. I dropped the camera and stumbled backward, my mind reeling from what I had seen. But as I turned to flee the clearing, I realized I was no longer alone. The humming had returned, closer now, and with it came the sound of something moving through the underbrush. Something large and wet, dragging itself across the forest floor with a sound like raw meat sliding across glass. I ran. I won't pretend otherwise. 12 years of wilderness experience, all my training, everything I thought I knew about survival, it all went out the window the moment I heard that thing coming toward me. I ran through the forest like a man possessed, branches tearing at my uniform, roots catching my boots, the humming following me like a predator's call. But as I ran, I began to understand what I was really running from. This wasn't some animal or natural phenomenon. This was something that collected skins like a person might collect clothes, trying them on to see which fit best. Something that could make its victims want to shed their own flesh, to peel themselves like fruit and hand over their humanity willingly. I made it back to the trail as the sun was setting, my chest burning with every breath. Behind me, the humming had faded to nothing, but I could still feel eyes watching me from the shadows between the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my patrol truck, and even then, my hand shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. That was 3 days ago. I filed my report, of course, but how do you explain something like that? How do you tell your supervisor that there's something in the forest that makes people want to shed their skin like snakes? The official report lists Derek Paulson as a missing person, possibly the victim of an animal attack. A search and rescue team went out to the campsite but found nothing. The tent was gone. The camping gear was gone. Even the shed skins hanging from the branches had disappeared, as if the whole thing had been some kind of fever dream. But I know what I saw. And I know what's still out there, humming its beautiful song in the deep woods, waiting for the next person to hear it and think it sounds lovely. waiting for the next person to decide their skin doesn't fit anymore. The thing is, I can't stop thinking about that melody. It's stuck in my head now, playing on repeat like a song you hear on the speakers at a grocery store. And lately, when I look in the mirror, my reflection looks a little loose around the edges. My skin feels tight in some places and baggy in others, like a suit that needs to be tailored. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I find myself humming along. And that's when I know it's time to leave this place forever, before I start thinking my skin doesn't fit anymore either. Before I start looking for something sharp enough to find the seams. The fire is dying now, and the forest is full of sounds that might be wind in the branches or might be something else entirely. Something moving between the trees, dragging itself through the undergrowth with that wet, sliding sound. Something humming a tune that makes my teeth ache and my skin crawl. I think it's time to go. Past time, really. But as I pack up my gear and prepare to leave this cursed place, I can't shake the feeling that it's already too late. That whatever got Derek Paulson has already gotten its hooks into me. That no matter how far I run, I'll always hear that humming in my head, always feel my skin trying to separate from what lies beneath. Because the truth is, I've been humming along for the last 3 days. And this morning, when I woke up, I found something at the foot of my sleeping bag that made my blood run cold. A piece of skin, translucent and warm to the touch, roughly the size and shape of my left hand. My left hand, which now feels strangely light and loose, as if the skin is no longer quite attached to the muscle and bone beneath. The humming is getting louder now, and it's not coming from the forest anymore. It's coming from inside me. And God help me, it sounds beautiful.